The funeral ended quietly, the way Robert Whittaker would have preferred. There were no long speeches, no dramatic gestures, only a small gathering beneath a gray Madison sky. Eleanor Whittaker stood beside the grave until the last handful of earth was smoothed over, her hands folded, her face composed. She accepted condolences, politely, thanked people for coming, and drove home alone once it was over. The house felt different the moment she stepped inside. Not empty exactly, but half empty, as if something essential had been removed and everything else was waiting to notice. Robert's coat still hung by the door. His shoes were lined up neatly beneath the bench, the way he had always left them. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. Eleanor set her purse down, removed her black coat, and stood in the entryway longer than she needed to, unsure where to begin. 33 years of marriage had filled the house with habits more than memories. She moved through the rooms automatically, turning on lamps as dusk settled outside. In the living room, she straightened a stack of mail on the side table. Most of it was ordinary, advertisements, bank statements, but several envelopes stood out, thicker than the rest. Medical billing notices, insurance summaries. She did not open them yet. She already knew what they would say. In the weeks leading up to Robert's death, the savings they had relied on quietly for decades had thinned faster than Eleanor liked to admit. Even now, after the funeral, expenses continued to arrive with steady indifference. Prescription balances, follow-up charges, daily costs that did not pause for grief. Eleanor sat at the dining table and reviewed their accounts with careful attention, pen in hand, making notes in the margins the way she always had. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were no longer comfortable. When she reached the final page, she stopped. There was one asset she had avoided thinking about since Robert's passing. The lake cabin. It was a modest place in rural Wisconsin. Close enough for a weekend drive, but far enough to feel separate from their everyday life. Robert had insisted on keeping it. Even during years when they rarely spoke about it, he had gone there alone, most weekends, claiming the quiet helped him think. Eleanor had accepted that explanation without pressing. At the time, it seemed easier. Now, practicality forced her to look at it differently. The cabin sat unused. The maintenance costs continued. Selling it would ease the financial strain immediately. Eleanor wrote the word cabin at the top of a clean page and underlined it once. The decision felt necessary, not cruel. Still, her chest tightened as she reached for her phone. The real estate agent answered on the second ring. Eleanor introduced herself calmly, explained the situation, and requested an appointment to discuss listing the property. Her voice remained steady throughout the call. She listened, agreed on a date, and ended the conversation with polite efficiency. Only after she set the phone down did she realize her hand was trembling slightly. She rested her palms on the table and took a slow breath. There was no dramatic rush of emotion, no sudden tears, just a dull pressure beneath her ribs. Persistent and quiet, Eleanor reminded herself that this was how survival worked now. Step by step, decision by decision. Outside, the light faded completely. The timeline of her life had narrowed to the present moment, measured in weeks since Robert's death and choices that could not be postponed. Eleanor gathered the unopened envelopes and placed them neatly in a folder. Tomorrow she would deal with them. Tonight, she would sit in the quiet house and accept what needed to be done. In the days that followed the call to the real estate agent, Eleanor found herself thinking less about the future and more about the past. The house, stripped of visitors and obligations, left too much room for memory. 33 years of marriage did not unfold all at once in her mind. Instead, it returned in fragments, small and ordinary, stitched together by habit rather than drama. For most of their life together, Robert had been steady. Not expressive, but reliable. He believed in routine, in showing up, in solving problems quietly. Eleanor had learned early that his love was not loud. It was practical, consistent, For decades, that had been enough. It was only in the last 3 years that something shifted. At the time, Eleanor had not named it as distance. She thought of it as fatigue, perhaps age. Robert began leaving town more often, driving out to the lake cabin on Friday evenings and returning late Sunday night. He said the quiet helped him think, helped him sleep. Madison felt crowded to him, he claimed. Eleanor did not argue. She had her own responsibilities, her own rhythms. When he was home, he spoke less. Conversations became shorter, more functional. He listened, nodded, answered when necessary, but rarely lingered in the moment. Eleanor remembered standing beside him in the kitchen, talking about small plans or household decisions, and realizing halfway through that he was already somewhere else. There were signs, though none of them seemed urgent at the time. Robert coughed often, a dry, persistent sound that followed him from room to room. He waved it off as allergies, then later as a lingering infection. Fatigue settled into his movements. He sat down more frequently, rose more slowly. Eleanor noticed, but so did many men their age. He had always been lean. Now he looked tired. The shaved head came next. One morning, Eleanor found him standing in the bathroom, rinsing the sink clean. His hair was gone, his scalp smooth and pale. He shrugged when she asked about it, said it was easier, said he was tired of dealing with hair. It suited him, he added lightly. Eleanor accepted that explanation without hesitation. Plenty of men did the same. When she asked about his health, Robert gave reasonable answers. Work stress, long weeks, a minor chronic issue the doctor was keeping an eye on. He did not like hospitals, he reminded her. Never had. Eleanor believed him because she had always believed him. Trust, built over decades, does not vanish easily. Their daughter, Hannah, was largely absent during those years. She was finishing her studies, then starting work, building a life of her own. Phone calls replaced visits. Holidays became shorter. Eleanor reassured herself that this was normal. Families changed. Children grew up. Still, irritation crept in where patience once lived. Eleanor remembered moments when Robert's silence felt deliberate, almost dismissive. She remembered thinking that he chose the cabin over them, that he preferred solitude to conversation. She never said those thoughts aloud, but they hardened quietly inside her. There were evenings when resentment surfaced in small ways, a sharper tone, an unspoken accusation in her eyes. Robert rarely responded. He absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything else, without defense. Eleanor mistook that silence for indifference. Looking back now, she saw those years differently, though not with anger. At the time, she had not believed she was missing anything important. She thought she was respecting his boundaries, honoring the man she loved by trusting his words. It was only now, in the stillness after his death, that Eleanor understood how loyalty could disguise itself as blindness, not because she did not care, but because she cared enough to believe him. The drive north felt longer than Eleanor expected, though she had made it many times before. She followed the real estate agent's car out of Madison and onto quieter roads, the city giving way to open stretches of land and late summer trees. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of light that softened everything without warming it. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel, her thoughts carefully contained. The landscape was familiar in a way that should have been comforting. Fields gave way to woods, and the air seemed to change as they approached the lake. This had always been Robert's argument for coming here: the quiet, the space, the sense of being removed from everything that pressed in too closely. Eleanor felt it now, too, though it did not bring relief. Instead, it made her aware of how little she truly knew about what had happened here. The cabin sat where it always had, close to the water but set back among the trees. From the outside, it looked better than Eleanor remembered. The siding was clean, the porch swept, the windows clear. The lawn had been trimmed recently, not overgrown or neglected as she had expected. It was the kind of maintenance that required regular attention. The real estate agent commented on it casually, noting that the property showed well. Eleanor nodded, but unease settled into her chest. No one but Robert had come here for years. She knew that, and yet the place looked lived in, cared for, as if it had never been abandoned at all. They walked the perimeter together. Eleanor trailed behind, taking in details she had never bothered to notice before. The repaired steps, the fresh seal along the deck railing, the absence of debris around the shed. Everything suggested purpose. Nothing suggested neglect. As they rounded the side of the cabin, a man stepped out from the neighboring property. He moved slowly, leaning slightly on a cane, his posture bent but alert. Eleanor recognized him at once. George Miller. Robert had mentioned him occasionally, usually in passing, as the neighbor who kept an eye on things when no one was around. George raised a hand in greeting and approached with careful steps. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the agent and back again. When Eleanor introduced herself, his expression softened, but concern flickered beneath it. They exchanged a few polite words before the real estate agent mentioned the reason for the visit. The change in George was immediate. His mouth tightened, and his gaze shifted toward the cabin as if reassessing it entirely. "You're selling?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor explained briefly that Robert had passed, that the cabin was no longer practical to keep. She spoke calmly, the words rehearsed by now. George did not respond right away. He stood in silence, his hand gripping the top of his cane. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar urgency. "I think you should wait," he said. The agent smiled politely, assuming hesitation over a neighbor's attachment to the area. Eleanor, however, felt something tighten inside her. She asked George what he meant. He hesitated, glancing toward the cabin again, then back at Eleanor. "There are things you don't know," he said carefully. Things Robert didn't want misunderstood. Eleanor felt a chill move through her, despite the mild air. She asked him to explain, but George shook his head. "Not out here," he said, "and not like this." He asked her, firmly but respectfully, to delay the sale, just for a little while, to take the time to see what Robert had done here. His tone was not accusatory nor sentimental. It was protective. Eleanor agreed without fully understanding why. As George turned back toward his property, she stood still, watching the cabin with new eyes. For the first time, she allowed the possibility that the place held more than memories. It held answers she had never thought to ask. George did not return immediately. When he did, he gestured for Eleanor to follow him past the cabin, toward a narrow path that led deeper into the trees. The real estate agent remained behind, distracted by a phone call and unaware of the shift taking place just beyond the clearing. Behind the cabin stood a small storage structure Eleanor barely remembered. It was set back far enough to be obscured by trees, its exterior plain and unremarkable. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a shed, the kind meant for tools or seasonal equipment. George stopped in front of it and rested both hands on his cane. Eleanor noticed the locks right away. There were several more than necessary. A heavy padlock on the door, a secondary latch reinforced with a steel clasp. The hardware was new, well-maintained, deliberately chosen. This was not casual security. It was intentional. George reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a ring of keys. He paused as if weighing something, then selected one and unlocked the first latch. The sound of metal clicking echoed too loudly in the quiet. Eleanor's chest tightened with each movement, though she could not yet name why. When the door finally opened, the smell was the first thing she noticed. Clean, clinical, not the damp, dusty scent she expected. Inside, the space was lit by a single overhead fixture. The room was small but orderly. Eleanor took a step forward and stopped. Medical equipment filled the space, arranged with careful precision. An oxygen concentrator sat against one wall, its tubing coiled neatly. A portable four-stand stood beside a narrow bed, the mattress covered with clean, fitted sheets. Shelving units held sealed medical supplies, labeled and stacked as if by habit. There was a chair positioned close to the bed, not for comfort but for necessity. This was not a hospital. There were no monitors, no alarms, no harsh lights. But it was unmistakably a place designed for care. Eleanor felt her breath shorten. Her mind searched for a practical explanation. Storage for someone else, perhaps, or equipment left behind by a previous owner. None of it fit. This place was active, maintained, purposeful. "Why is this here?" she asked quietly. George did not answer at once. He stepped inside, moving slowly, and rested his hand on the back of the chair. His eyes lingered on the bed, then the supplies, as though seeing them for the first time himself. "This is where Robert stayed," he said finally. The words landed without meaning at first. Eleanor stared at him, waiting for clarification that did not come. Her thoughts stalled, unable to move forward or back. George cleared his throat. He explained that Robert had come here nearly every weekend, that he arrived late on Fridays and left before dawn on Mondays, that he kept to a routine: rest, treatment, recovery, then returned home as if nothing had happened. Eleanor listened, but the room felt unreal, as though she were standing inside a carefully constructed lie. Everything she believed about those years began to shift. Piece by piece, George spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it carried weight. He described doctors who visited quietly, equipment delivered and removed without attention, supplies restocked regularly. He spoke of Robert's insistence on privacy, on doing things properly, on leaving no trace that might worry his family. Eleanor turned slowly, taking in the room again, the bed, the chair, the silence. Her certainty collapsed in on itself. The cabin was no longer a retreat. It was a boundary, a place where Robert had lived a life she had never seen. The past, once neatly contained in memory, pressed into the present with sudden force. Eleanor realized she was no longer standing in a storage room. She was standing inside the truth she had never been meant to find. George did not speak right away. He closed the door to the storage structure behind them, muting the distant sounds of the lake and the wind moving through the trees. The quiet that followed felt intentional, as if this truth required its own boundary. "It started 3 years ago," he said at last, "not long after Robert bought this place." Eleanor felt the timeline settle into place with devastating clarity. 3 years. The same span she had been replaying in her mind. The distance, the absences, the changes she had explained away one by one. "He collapsed one afternoon," George continued, "right over there near the dock. I heard the noise and came running. He was coughing so hard I thought he couldn't breathe." George described how Robert had insisted on driving himself to a clinic instead of calling emergency services, how he returned days later, quieter than before, with a stack of papers he never showed anyone. Tests followed, consultations, a confirmed diagnosis delivered without ceremony. Advanced cancer, already progressed by the time it was discovered. Eleanor felt the word press against her chest, heavy and unreal. Cancer was a word spoken in hospitals, in whispered phone calls, in other families' tragedies. It did not belong to her marriage, not to Robert. "He didn't want you or Hannah to know," George said gently, as if anticipating her response. That was the first thing he said. According to George, Robert had listened calmly as doctors explained treatment options. Aggressive, hospital-based intervention, long inpatient stays, the possibility of extended time measured in months, not years, and the certainty of dependence, visible decline, and loss of privacy. He asked about alternatives, George said. Not cures, just management. Robert had sought second opinions, private consultations, specialists who agreed to work outside hospital settings, weekend-based care, controlled treatments designed to slow progression, not reverse it, enough to function, enough to remain himself. This cabin was not an escape. It was a compromise. Every Friday, Robert arrived here already bracing himself. Treatments were administered carefully, spaced to allow recovery before returning home. The equipment Eleanor had seen was not excessive. It was exactly what was required for palliative care done responsibly. Clean conditions, trainat profissionals, strict protocols. He didn't want you to remember him as sick, George said. That mattered more to him than anything. The shaved head returned to Eleanor's mind with new weight. She had assumed it was a preference, maybe age, maybe convenience. Robert had never hidden it, never acted self-conscious. Now she understood why. It was not denial. It was control, by choosing when and how his appearance changed. Robert had shielded Eleanor and Hannah from the visible markers that might force questions. He had shaped the version of himself they were allowed to see. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She lowered herself onto the chair beside the bed, suddenly aware of how much effort it must have taken for Robert to stand after treatments, to drive home, to sit at the dinner table and pretend he was only tired. He refused the hospital at the end, George added quietly, said he didn't want machines, didn't want to become a patient in his own life. Instead, Robert planned. He prepared medications. He coordinated visits. He chose pain management that allowed him to remain present without alarming those around him. When the treatment stopped working, he stopped coming here. He wanted to be home, George said. With you. The pieces aligned with cruel precision. Robert's sudden tenderness in those final months. The way he lingered in rooms. The long looks Eleanor had felt but never understood. He had not been withdrawing. He had been saying goodbye. Eleanor's grief shifted, twisting into something sharper. Disbelief gave way to guilt, quiet, suffocating, relentless. She had trusted him, believed him, loved him without question, and in doing so, she had unknowingly left him to carry the heaviest burden alone. This wasn't betrayal, George said softly, reading her expression. It was love, just love that chose silence. Eleanor closed her eyes. The room blurred. The cabin was no longer a place to be sold. It was a witness, a testament to a man who had protected his family not by staying close, but by stepping away. And in that realization, Eleanor understood that the truth Robert hid was never meant to hurt her. It was meant to spare her. Eleanor found the journal in a shallow drawer beneath the work table, wrapped carefully in a plain canvas sleeve. It was not hidden in the sense of being concealed, but it had been placed where it would not be discovered accidentally, as if Robert had known that when the time came, someone would be looking, not rummaging, but searching. The notebook was worn but intact. A dark blue cover, no title, no name, only a small date written on the first page, nearly 3 years earlier. Eleanor sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath her weight, and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Robert's. Steady, precise, the same hand that had signed birthday cards and tax forms and notes left on the kitchen counter. Seeing it here, in this place, felt like stepping into a room she had never been invited into while he was alive. The first entries were clinical, dates, symptoms, short descriptions of pain, nausea, weakness, notes about medications and side effects. He wrote as if recording data, not emotion, as though structure itself might keep fear at bay. But the tone shifted as the pages went on. I couldn't stand today, one entry read. Collapsed near the sink. Had to wait for the room to stop spinning before I could move again. I told Eleanor last night that I was tired. That was easier. Eleanor paused, her fingers tightening around the edge of the page. Another entry followed days later. Pain is worse after treatment. The doctor says it's expected. I don't tell them how bad it gets at night. If I write it down, it exists. That's enough. The words were plain, unembellished, and devastating in their restraint. Robert wrote about the fear that arrived without warning. Not fear of death itself, but of being seen diminished, of becoming someone Eleanor would have to care for instead of lean on. He described moments when he sat in the cabin alone, listening to the lake. Breathing through pain he did not allow to reach his face at home. If they know, everything changes, he wrote. Every look becomes careful, every word measured. I don't want my life to narrow to concern. There were pages where the handwriting wavered, the ink uneven. I thought I could make it through today without medication. I was wrong. Couldn't stop shaking. George helped. I hate needing help. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had known Robert as proud, yes, but also steady, dependable. She had never imagined how much effort it must have taken for him to preserve that image when his body was failing him. Several entries addressed the same subject again and again. Silence. I am not lying to them, he wrote once. I am choosing what they don't have to carry. He wrote about Hannah, her studies, her future, her stubbornness inherited from him, about Eleanor's exhaustion, caring for her own mother, about the quiet calculation he made every day, weighing what truth would cost them. If I tell them, they suffer now. If I don't, they suffer later. I choose later. I won't be there to see it. Eleanor had to stop reading for a moment. She pressed the journal against her chest, breathing carefully, as though the words themselves might overwhelm her if she moved too fast. When she continued, she reached the entries about his appearance. Shaving my head was not about hiding anything, he wrote. It was the one decision I could make without explanation. Hair falls out on its own. A razor is a choice. He explained that the shaved head gave him control over the narrative. No gradual sinning. No visible marker that invited questions. If anyone noticed, he could dismiss it. If they didn't, all the better. I needed something I could decide for myself, he wrote, when so much else was already decided. The later entries were harder to read. The pain became more frequent, his body less reliable. There were descriptions of lying on the floor, unable to stand, waiting for strength to return, of sitting in the car before driving home, rehearsing normalcy. Smile. Sit upright. Eat something. Don't cough too much. Eleanor recognized the man who came home on Sunday nights, pale and quiet, claiming fatigue. She had thought he was withdrawing. Now she saw how much energy it took for him simply to appear unchanged. Near the end of the journal, the tone softened. I don't regret this, he wrote. I regret that they will feel I shut them out. I didn't. I held them so close I couldn't let them see the damage. The final pages were shorter, the handwriting less steady. If Eleanor is reading this, it means I failed to protect her from the truth forever. I'm sorry for that, but I hope she understands that silence was the last thing I had to give. Eleanor closed the journal slowly. Her hands were trembling now, not from shock, but from intimacy. This was Robert unguarded. Robert afraid. Robert choosing love in the only way he believed possible. The cabin was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. This was the center of everything, the life he had lived alongside hers without ever letting her inside. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he trusted her too much to burden her. And in that understanding, Eleanor felt her grief deepen, sharpen, and finally, fully take shape. Hannah arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, her car crunching over the gravel driveway with a sharpness that felt out of place in the quiet. Eleanor watched from the porch as her daughter stepped out, shoulders tight, face already set in confusion and irritation. You canceled the sale, Hannah said without greeting. The agent called me. She said you told her not to come back. Eleanor nodded. I did. Hannah looked past her, toward the cabin, the trees, the lake. Why? Eleanor did not answer immediately. She gestured toward the back of the property instead. Come inside first. There's something you need to see. They walked together in silence. Hannah's steps were quick, impatient. Eleanor's were careful, deliberate, as though each movement carried weight. When they reached the storage structure and Eleanor unlocked the door, Hannah stopped short. What is this? She asked, her voice sharp. Why does it look like? She fell silent as her eyes took in the bed, the equipment, the supplies arranged with quiet precision. Eleanor spoke softly. This is where your father came every weekend. Hannah turned to her, disbelief flashing across her face. That's not funny. It's not a joke, Eleanor said. He was sick. Hannah, for 3 years. The words landed heavily, then bounced away, rejected. No, Hannah said immediately. He would have told us. He had a cough. He was tired. That doesn't mean he had cancer, Eleanor said. Advanced. He found out 3 years ago. Hannah shook her head, backing away as if the space itself were lying to her. You're wrong. You have to be wrong. He worked. He drove. He argued with me. He yelled at me for not calling enough. Eleanor's voice wavered but held. He chose not to tell us. He didn't want you to know. Hannah's anger surfaced suddenly, sharp and uncontrolled. That's impossible. That's selfish. That's not something a parent does. She turned away, pacing, running a hand through her hair. We fought. We barely spoke some weeks. And you're telling me he was just, what, pretending? Eleanor reached into her bag and took out the journal. She held it out, not forcing it into Hannah's hands, simply offering it. He wrote everything down, she said. If you want to understand, read it. Hannah hesitated. Her hands trembled as she took the notebook, as though it might burn her. She sat down hard on the chair by the wall and opened it. At first she skimmed. Then she slowed. Her breathing changed. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. Eleanor watched her daughter's face shift as the words sank in. Confusion giving way to recognition, recognition to pain. Hannah's jaw tightened. Her eyes filled, then overflowed. He missed my birthday, Hannah said suddenly, her voice breaking. I screamed at him for that. I said, he cared more about that stupid cabin than me. She turned the page, reading again, slower now. He helped me with my exams, she whispered. I thought it was luck. I didn't know he called anyone. I didn't know. Her shoulders began to shake. I called him cold, distant. I told you he didn't care anymore. Eleanor knelt beside her, placing a hand on her daughter's back. We didn't know. Hannah pressed the journal to her chest. I was angry at him for leaving us alone with everything. I thought he was choosing distance. She looked up at her mother, eyes red and searching. He was choosing us. They sat together on the floor, the space between them closing without words. The resentment Hannah had carried, sharp, unresolved, began to soften, reshaped by truth. I don't know how to forgive myself, Hannah said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about understanding. Hannah leaned into her, something childlike in the gesture. I wish I had known. So do I, Eleanor said. But knowing now matters too. Outside, the light shifted. Late afternoon, sliding toward evening. Inside the small structure, mother and daughter remained still, bound not only by grief, but by a shared reckoning, one that did not erase the past but finally allowed it to make sense. And in that understanding, something fragile but real began to heal. They did not open the envelope right away. The will had been placed carefully inside a sealed folder, labeled in Robert's handwriting and stored in a small fireproof box Eleanor had not noticed before. It sat beneath the workbench, unobtrusive, as if it had been waiting patiently for the moment when its contents would no longer be theoretical. Even before reading it, Eleanor understood something essential. Robert had not left things unfinished. They returned to the cabin's main room and sat at the small wooden table by the window. The lake outside was still, reflecting the pale afternoon sky. Eleanor broke the seal slowly, her hand steady in a way that surprised her. The document was formal, prepared with legal precision, dated 2 years earlier, properly notarized. Robert had taken care to ensure it would stand without ambiguity or dispute. The opening clauses were straightforward. His modest savings, the house in Madison, personal belongings, everything divided clearly between Eleanor and Hannah. No confusion, no hidden conditions. Then Eleanor reached the section marked Special Instructions regarding the lake property. She paused. The language shifted, still legally sound, but unmistakably Robert's. He did not refer to the cabin as an asset. He called it the retreat property. He specified that it was not to be sold, leased, or transferred for private profit. Instead, he requested, firmly, unmistakably, that it be repurposed into a short-term support retreat for individuals undergoing cancer treatment. Not a hospital, not a clinic, a place to rest. He outlined his reasoning carefully, that many patients, especially those without resources or strong family support, had nowhere to go between treatments, that hospitals were overcrowded, impersonal, that homes were often ill-equipped emotionally and physically. He wrote about dignity, about space, about the importance of allowing people to suffer without being hidden and to heal without being pitted. This was not a dream scribbled in grief. It was a plan. Robert had included practical considerations, limited capacity, volunteer medical oversight, partnerships with local providers. He emphasized that the retreat should not promise cures, only care, that its purpose was not to extend life at any cost, but to improve the quality of whatever time remained. Eleanor read the words slowly, line by line. He had thought this through while dying. At the end of the section, his voice, unmistakable even within legal phrasing, became personal. He wrote that the cabin had never been a place of escape. It had been a place where he learned how fragile and valuable quiet could be, where pain could exist without becoming spectacle, where he could be ill without becoming invisible. He expressed hope, not expectation, that Eleanor and Hannah might understand his intention, that they might see the cabin not as a reminder of absence, but as a continuation of care. Hannah sat silently beside her, absorbing each sentence. When Eleanor finished reading, neither of them spoke for a long moment. "He planned all of this," Hannah said finally, "while we thought he was pulling away." Eleanor nodded. He was preparing. The realization settled with unexpected clarity. Robert had not been living a divided life. He had been building something quietly, deliberately in parallel with the life he shared with them. The cabin was not a secret in the way Eleanor had feared. It was a foundation. For the first time since his death, Eleanor felt something shift beneath the grief. Not relief, not closure, but direction. Loss had taken something irreplaceable from her, but it had not left her empty-handed. Robert had left her a purpose. And as Eleanor folded the document carefully and placed it back into its folder, she understood that selling the cabin had never truly been an option. Not because of sentiment, but because Robert's life, even in its final years, had been aimed forward, toward something that would outlast him. The decision not to sell the cabin did not come with ceremony. Eleanor did not announce it to anyone beyond a brief message to the real estate agent. No explanations, no justifications, just a simple withdrawal of the listing. When the agent asked if she was certain, Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "It's no longer for sale." What followed was not a sudden transformation, but a slow, deliberate shift, one shaped by grief, intention, and patience. Eleanor returned to the cabin again the following week, this time without the weight of discovery pressing against her chest. She walked the property differently now, not as an outsider, not as someone preparing to let go, but as a steward of something unfinished. With Hannah beside her, she began by doing very little. They cleaned, not aggressively, not with the urgency of renovation, but carefully preserving what Robert had arranged. The medical space remained intact, its order respected. Eleanor could almost sense his presence in the way everything had been placed with care, as though consideration itself had become habit. Hannah moved through the cabin with a new attentiveness. She noticed small details her father must have chosen deliberately: the placement of chairs near windows, the way light entered certain rooms, the quiet distance between structures. Nothing felt accidental. They began making calls. Eleanor reached out to a local physician whose name Robert had mentioned in his notes, a doctor who had quietly consulted during those hidden years. She explained the situation plainly without dramatics. To her surprise, the response was immediate and thoughtful. "This kind of place is rare," the doctor said, "but necessary." Gradually, others followed. A nurse who had worked in oncology for decades, a social worker familiar with end-of-life support. People who did not ask for explanations, only for clarity of purpose. The cabin did not become a facility. It did not advertise. It did not promise recovery. It became a sanctuary. Patients arrived quietly, usually between treatments. Men and women exhausted not only by illness, but by the emotional strain of navigating it. Some came alone. Others arrived with family members who needed rest just as badly. They stayed for days, sometimes weeks. They rested. They spoke when they wanted to. They were left alone when they needed silence. Eleanor was present but unobtrusive. She learned how to prepare simple meals that didn't overwhelm sensitive stomachs. She learned how to listen without offering reassurance she could not guarantee. She learned that being useful did not require answers. Hannah's role evolved naturally. She began helping where she could, organizing supplies, assisting visitors, asking questions she had once avoided. Over time, those questions grew more focused, more technical. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the lake darken under a low sky, Hannah spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about what I want to do," she said. Eleanor turned to her, attentive but cautious. "I don't think I can go back to what I was planning before," Hannah continued. "I don't think it fits anymore." She spoke about healthcare, about nursing, about being present in the spaces where people were most vulnerable, not out of obligation, but understanding. "He did this alone," Hannah said. "I don't want other people to have to." Eleanor did not try to guide her. She simply listened. She recognized the moment for what it was. Not grief-speaking, but purpose-forming. Time moved forward, marked not by dates, but by seasons. Summer came, then fall. The cabin adapted quietly to its new life. Word spread slowly, through referrals and conversations rather than announcements. The sanctuary remained small by design, limited in scale, but intentional in impact. Eleanor found that her days had regained shape. Not ease, but meaning. The grief did not vanish. It settled, integrating itself into her work, into her presence. Robert was no longer only a memory tied to loss. He was present in the rhythm of what they were building. One afternoon, Eleanor stood alone near the edge of the property, watching a patient walk slowly along the path Robert had cleared years earlier. She realized then that the cabin had never been a place of retreat from life. It had been a place where life, even when fragile, was allowed to continue with dignity. And in honoring Robert's quiet choices, Eleanor had found a way not only to survive his absence, but to carry him forward. By the time the second winter passed, the cabin no longer felt like a secret. It had become what Robert intended. Not a facility, not an institution, but a living place with a quiet rhythm of its own. People arrived quietly and left the same way. Some stayed briefly. Some returned. Others never came back. Carried forward only in memory and in the small adjustments Eleanor and Hannah made afterward, refining the space with care. The lake remained unchanged. In the early mornings, mist still rose from the water in slow, patient layers. The trees surrounding the property stood as they always had, unmoved by grief or purpose. Seasons turned without acknowledgement of what the cabin had become. Nature did not mark time by loss. Eleanor often walked the grounds alone before anyone else was awake. She did not rush. She did not bring lists or plans. She simply moved through the space, touching the railing Robert had repaired, the path he had cleared, the bench he had placed facing the water. She no longer searched for signs of him. He was present in the order of things, in the calm that had replaced urgency, in the way patients were allowed to rest without explanation, in the way families spoke more softly here, as if the land itself asked for gentleness. Eleanor thought often of silence. For a long time after learning the truth, silence had felt like a wound, proof of distance, of something withheld. Now, she understood it differently. Robert's silence had not been absence. It had been intention. He had not disappeared from their lives during those 3 years. He had remained fully present in the only way he believed would protect them. His secrecy was not a rejection of intimacy, but an act of containment, holding pain within himself so it would not spill outward and consume those he loved. Understanding did not erase the ache. There were still moments when Eleanor wished she had known, when she imagined what it might have been like to sit beside him in that cabin, to hold his hand through the worst of it, to share the burden he had carried alone. Those thoughts came quietly now without accusation. They passed. Hannah had grown into her role with a steadiness that surprised Eleanor. Her path forward had changed shape, guided not by reaction, but by resolve. She did not speak often about her father anymore. She did not need to. His influence showed itself in her patience, in her presence, in the way she listened before acting. Together, mother and daughter had learned something neither had expected to learn through loss, that endurance did not require hardness, and strength did not require noise. On a late afternoon, Eleanor sat by the window in the main room, watching the light shift across the lake. A patient rested nearby, breathing evenly. The space was quiet, but not empty. Eleanor thought of Robert then, not as he had been in his final days, nor as the man she had buried, but as he had lived alongside her for decades, practical, reserved, devoted in ways that did not always announce themselves. She understood now that love did not always arrive with confession or shared suffering. Sometimes it arrived disguised as normalcy, as routine, as restraint. The cabin stood, solid and unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. It did not advertise what offered. It did not demand attention. It simply remained, and in remaining, it carried forward what Robert had left behind. Not his illness, not his silence, but the careful, enduring love that had shaped every choice he made. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to the lake. What remained was not sorrow. What remained was peace, earned slowly and held with quiet strength.